Hello, welcome to Cinema Savvy. We have reached the 9th film in our James Bond retrospective with the 1974 film directed by the fourth and final time by Guy Hamilton. It is, of course, The Man with the Golden Gun. So last week we covered Live and Let Die, which, of course, was the first Roger Moore outing as James Bond, which was a very interesting conversation. So if you haven't checked that out, watch this first, but then please do go back to that one if you haven't checked it out. And I think tonight's conversation is going to be equally as interesting. As you can see from below the screen, below me right there, we are joined with our two guests. So we have Agents Cam and Agent Scott from the SpyHards Podcast. We managed to get all of our schedules aligned. We're so great to have you on the show today. And thank you for joining us today to talk about Man with the Golden Gun.
Well, thank you for having us. Firstly, it's an absolute pleasure to come and speak about a Bond that we haven't even touched on our podcast yet. We haven't even got to our Roger Moore. So this is fresh ground.
Yeah, any chance we can get to talk about Nick Nack, Scaramanga, this is gold, gold, baby.
So we're going to cover it. We're going to cover this whole thing. So as always, we always say this is going to be completely spoiler filled. This is an open table discussion. So we're going to go into everything. If you've joined the show before, you know the schedule by now. We talk about Bond. We talk about the Bond girls, the villains, especially the villains. Absolutely, the Bond theme, everything in between with this. It's just a fun discussion on the Bond films as we go through each one in the lead up to No Time to Die. But before we do so, over to George with the socials.
Absolutely, guys. As we always say, we love you guys commenting along. The Bond films have been very fun. We've got a lot of feedback, a lot of discussions, a lot of varying opinions, which is lovely. Because when you've got 24 films, you don't want the same opinion of everyone. So comment below your thoughts on Man of the Golden Gun, the Roger Moore era, as we are almost at the Spy Who Loved Me, one of the big ones, and we are further away from A View to a Kill, which we're all very excited to be talking about soon. But in the meantime, of course, hit that subscribe button if you're new to the channel. We've got a lot more Bond on the way, a lot of other films, new releases, all that kind of stuff. And the best way to find out about all of those is by getting us on our social medias, which is Twitter at cinema_savvy, facebook.com/cinemasavvy, and letterboxd.com also/cinemasavvy. So have a check of that. That's where we announce all our videos. Some stuff is done last minute, some stuff is pre-recorded, as today is a very hot, sweltering Sunday. There's been football on. The weather's insane. Cam's joining us from Canada as well. For people that couldn't clock it, you may think he's in England, but he's not. So we really appreciate the time taken out to join us today. But also, we're going to quickly hand over to you guys with the question. As obviously, we'll introduce the podcast just after, and we've got some of the socials below in the description where we can find you. But can you each tell us who your favourite James Bond is?
I think Cam, you take us away with this one. I think it might be quite apt.
Well, I mean, my answer is always David Niven in the 1967 Casino Royale. No, the honest answer is I grew up on Roger Moore. Like, that was the first Bond I ever saw in View to a Kill. And so I always kind of have to say my favorite is Roger Moore, but I completely think the best is Sean Connery. You watch those first three, Dr. No through Goldfinger, and it's like there's no better Bond performance. Even Daniel Craig, as much as I love him, will never top the balance of all the kind of elements of Bond are right there in those first three. Whereas Daniel Craig, they were like, cut the humor. This guy's not good at humor. And, a lot of the elements that are classic were kind of refined for Craig. I think, Connery's the total package.
Definitely.
Yeah, it's hard to argue with that. I was a bit later. I was brought in by I was brought in by GoldenEye, I should say. Not Goldmember. That's the wrong franchise. The GoldenEye was the first film I saw. And so Pierce Brosnan was my Bond. And for the longest time, I measured up every other Bond to the yardstick that is Pierce Brosnan. And, and then I saw Die Another Day. And then I thought, okay, maybe I should revise this a little bit. But my favorite Bond is Pierce Brosnan. But I, again, also acknowledge that really the purest example from the literary angle, the Ian Fleming vision of Bond has to be Sean Connery. Look at that guy's man rug. Look at that hairy chest.
I think it's a walk away at the moment, isn't it, for Connery? I think we're kind of mentally tallying what people are saying is their favorite Bond, and everyone has their objectively favorite, but everyone kind of goes back to the source, don't they, with Connery for the best, I think. I think that's a universal thing at the moment that we've seen so far.
Yeah, there's no better scene in the history of Bond, I don't think, than that moment where Sean Connery's sitting in Dent's hotel room waiting to assassinate him. You can't top that in terms of just pure Bond.
Yeah, absolutely. Go on, sorry, George.
I'd love to talk about Connor. It's the sort of, we don't really get many cold-blooded Bond kills, but that is, that's the first film and one of the most powerful ones, which I think is a really big thing with it. But I'm going to stand my Pierce Brosnan mountain. I love Die Another Day. We'll get to that at some point in the next few months.
Sorry, I have to go. I have to go now.
No, I'm biased. World's Not Enough was my first Bond film. Die Another Day was the first one I saw at the cinema, so I just use that as my excuse. I'm terrified of rewatching it, but I'm so excited at the same time to because it's, who doesn't want an ice chase? Anyway, we'll say that for August time. August is going to be the Pierce Brosnan month. Obviously, we are talking Man with the Golden Gun, and as we always do, we're going to start with the pre-credit scene. Before we get to the Hall of Mirrors, I'm going to pass this straight over to Chris, because I guess we can say we get our introduction to one of the most iconic actors in the history of film, as far as I'm concerned.
Oh my God, yes. Sir Christopher Lee, who I believe was the step cousin of Ian Fleming. I think I did some reading earlier, so he had ties to that. I think Fleming originally said that he would be perfect for Dr. No, and then according to Christopher Lee, so, take it with a pinch of salt, Ian Fleming was a very forgetful man and forgot to tell the producers of Dr. No that he was requesting that he play Dr. No, so finally he gets to play Scaramanga. Christopher Lee is just absolutely tremendous. Sorry, Sir Christopher Lee is absolutely tremendous. One of my favorite actors, just a force to be reckoned with in any film that he's in, even if it's from one of like the Hammer horror films. And it's so great to finally see him in a James Bond film as well. Just his voice, he absolutely commands the screen. And this is kind of going to be like Live and Let Die for me in a way, in that I had so different memories of watching my opinions on Live and Let Die and this film from when I first watched it. This was my second time watching these films, actually, in preparation for the reviews. And it didn't quite land with me as much as I remember, similar to Live and Let Die, as I mentioned. And that's kind of down to the fact that in my memory somewhere, I thought that Christopher Lee was in this film a hell of a lot more than he actually is. And he's kind of, he's in the opening scene and we get like a little bit of him, but he doesn't really come into his own until like the very final act, maybe like the final 20, 25 minutes or so. That being said, it's Christopher Goddamn Lee. And he's a very interesting character. I like that we get introduced to a character with Scaramanga that he is basically the opposite side of the coin to Bond. I know in many ways you could say that Blofeld is that character. And I think that Blofeld probably fits the bill more for sort of like a character overall being the opposite to Bond. But in terms of his prowess and, his skill and how methodical he is, Scaramanga really is that character. And I think in the original draft of the script, I know that Mankiewicz did the original draft of the script and focused a lot more on Scaramanga. And I think really kind of dialed into that divide between the two characters and, like the polar opposites of each other. And then I think, unfortunately, in subsequent rewrites, Maibaum came back onto the scene and, patched up the script. That was kind of lost somewhat in the script. As it is, Scaramanga is a fascinating villain in that, he is played by Christopher Lee. It's a good introductory scene. It's weird that we don't open with Bond. We open straight away with the villain and Nick Nack and the very bizarre kind of funhouse, house of horror kind of thing that we've got going on in this film with the Hall of Mirrors and everything. It's a very different opening from anything that we've seen in the previous Bond films, but I can't quite pin it down. I guess this is going to come into my conversation later on when we talk about Scaramanga properly, but the whole funhouse thing doesn't kind of align with his character for me. It seems very out of place. Like he is this sort of like wealthy businessman, wealthy baron, assassin for hire, $1 million a contract. Why would he have a fun house? It seems to me that would benefit more from a more theatrical kind of villain that's, smoke and mirrors, deception, like a kind of Mysterio kind of bad guy that would rely on illusion and everything like that. Maybe even for, oh God, I forgot the name of the villain already. It sounds like Scaramanga, the villain from last week. Kananga, thank you. That the whole voodoo and mysticism, this would fit more in line with something to do with him rather than Scaramanga. But that being said, there's a charm to it. You remember it, it's the one with the wacky funhouse with Christopher Lee. So I think it's a good introductory scene. It's very different, I would say, to a lot of the previous Bond entries.
Yeah, I think a big thing with the opening scene is I don't think I've ever seen Christopher Lee in a tracksuit before, and that's what always catches me off guard. It's the tracksuit, and then obviously there's the third nipple, which also comes into it. It's kind of like, you are the opposite of Bond. If we'd had like A View to a Kill Roger Moore against like this Christopher Lee, I think would have been even funnier. But just those mental images, like I can't ever take out my head when I think of him. I always go back to obviously Star Wars as a massive Star Wars fan. So many of his other work, even Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, when you think of that deep voice, and it's always like, nope, here's third nipple tracksuit, Christopher Lee. And I still love him for it. I love the Hall of Mirrors. I'm going to jump out and say, in terms of opening credits, I prefer the first one to the final one. And I think it's because you have the intrigue. You don't know what's going on. And it's a really good opening credit scene, I think. And then you do get the weirdness of, his cowboys. And it's more of like an intimidation tactic. But at the same time, I can't imagine Scaramanga really sort of, getting a kick out of terrorizing them. He just wants to get them himself. But I think it's a great introduction to the villain side. And as far as Bond films go, this is probably, I don't want to say one of the strongest villain films, but the presence of villains, I think this is one of the better ones where you know who they are from the get-go, so you can build them up over film. Like, for example, Nick Nack, we'll get to him later, but whenever he pops up in a scene later on, because we've seen him at the beginning, we know, there's some villainous thing in play here, whereas if you hadn't, it'd be a very ambiguous character saying, what's this guy doing popping up here and there? So I think it sets up nicely. But at the same time, the biggest criticism for me of this entire film is that it feels like they just wanted to do Christopher Lee versus James Bond, which I'm here for. And it's basically like the King Kong v Godzilla, I guess you could say, of the sort of 70s. I don't know. That's always been my thoughts on how I feel about this film. But I'm going to pass over to you guys. What do you think?
Well, if we're talking about the pre-credit sequence, the first thing that springs to my mind is, I used to work in gyms, and one thing I've realized is missing from modern gyms is pommel horses. They should be. I think that's why everyone's just not in shape anymore. They're not doing, ring rope stuff. It's all missing. No, I'm kidding. The main thing that jumped out to me when I was rewatching it this afternoon is I liked how they're playing with perception within that scene. So you've got the visual difference between, Nick Nack and Scaramanga, and you think Scaramanga's in charge, but then Nick Nack's running it from the booth. So you don't know, there's like a dynamic shift between the two. You actually don't know who's in charge technically until you figure out it's like a maze that he's running. And so I like that sort of, it's messing with what you think should be happening. And then he shoots James Bond and you're uneasy. You're sort of left a bit shaken. And then it hits you with that song, which I'm not a fan of. But I liked it. I think it was actually quite a strong opener for a Bond film. I think it actually tried to do something. It had a bit of an interesting subtext running throughout.
Yeah, I'm a moderate fan on this one. It's interesting that you follow Live and Let Die. It's the first two Roger Moores. He doesn't feature into the opening, pre-credit sequences in either one. It's more about establishing the threat, and I feel like this one has to do probably four things. It's got to establish Scaramanga as being very dangerous. I think it does that quite well. It has to sort of establish his world, which, we get all in this, James Bond Island out there in Thailand. I think it does a really good job in setting up, Nick Nack as the servant, Andrea Anders kind of passively watching. It has to set up the geography of the course that we're going to see paid off later in the movie. I think it's iffy on that. The geography of this whole funhouse is questionable. All we really get is that Bond goes through the exact same series of, moments as the same times as this gangster at the start, but I still don't have a good sense of the geography of that course. But I guess lastly, it has to set up that the man with the golden gun really wants to hunt James Bond with the mannequin there at the end. And does he? Because that's something that throughout the movie, he's like, well, Mr. Bond, I hope we don't run into each other again. It's like, you have like statues of the man in your house. It seems like you really like him. It also has a really like sly moment that I don't know many people catch, which is at the very end, he shoots the four fingers off the Bond mannequin, and then it shows a close-up of Bond's face, and a fifth shot goes off. Now, what do you think that fifth shot is going off for?
Oh God, I don't know. That didn't even cross my mind. Is it trying to do a misdirection as to who shot who at the end with the fifth?
No, I think he's like emasculating Bond. I think he's...
Oh, yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
Because that would have been interesting to see.
The four fingers and then something. Something gets that delayed fifth shot. So
his next weapon.
Yeah. It's Bond's golden gun. So
We'll talk more about that when we get to the main theme, right? With those innuendos, every single line.
I think the reason this one though falls, and why I say I'm a moderate fan, is when you think of the Bond pre-credits, there's usually like a really iconic stunt. Like that's your takeaway. This one, you don't get that as much. It's more just establishing Christopher Lee. And so it's effective storytelling wise, but no one's probably going to walk out of this one, and be like, oh man, that pre-credit sequence, amazing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, I agree with George, what you said, how the opening scene, it's more methodical. It feels better paced. It creates that sense of unease. And we don't know what's going on. It's so completely out there from what we've seen from the previous James Bond films. And then when you get to the end, granted, you kind of know the layout of this funhouse and you know how it kind of goes down and what's included in that funhouse with the mannequins and the Hall of Mirrors and the misdirection. It did feel quite anticlimactic at the end. But to what you said, Scott, about how there's that it plays with your perception. You don't know if Nick Nack's in charge. You don't know if Scaramanga's in charge. And I messaged you, George. I remember when I was watching it going, I thought Christopher Lee was the main bad guy, but Nick Nack's kind of the main bad guy. So it's a very weird dynamic between the two of them. And I don't know if it ever kind of highlights what that dynamic is. I think Christopher Lee has a line towards the end saying that, Nick Nack's sort of like a manservant, like a butler kind of character. But, maybe Scaramanga just does this because he knows he's the best. He wants to set himself this task, this course, just to kind of test himself, to toy with his prey almost, which I guess is interesting. But as I said, on like a repeat watch, the Hall of Mirrors and Funhouse didn't kind of slide with me. I think it's interesting from a visual standpoint. I think the sets as well in that part are definitely one of the best. And, we'll get onto the sets later as well when we talk about the MI5 base, where it's in the wreckage of the ship and it's all kind of like off to an angle. I thought that was really interesting. So I love some of the cinematography in this and especially the set building, but it just didn't really make sense for the character for me. We'll probably get into Scaramanga later on as we go through as well. Let's talk about the man himself again, Bond. So we talked last week how the opening scene in Live and Let Die with Bond wasn't like this big grandiose action scene. It was quite understated for an introduction, especially to a new Bond. Especially when we went to Lazenby, they kind of played with that reveal and they were building up to it. You'd get a quick glance of like the cigarette in his mouth and his hand on the wheel. And then you get that opening action scene on the beach with Diana Rigg. This one as well felt quite understated. It's just kind of Bond, doing what he does best. But I do have a soft spot in my heart for Roger Moore as well. He's definitely the more quippier comedic Bond, I would say, probably out of all of them. But he's great in this. I'd say he's probably more in line of how he was in Live and Let Die. I don't think it's the strongest Moore performance, and I don't know if that's down to the writing that kind of goes along with him or the Bond girl that he has to work off of, which, we'll get into later. And she's definitely not one of my favorite Bond girls in the entire legacy of these films. That's for damn sure. But Moore's just so much fun to watch. And it is nice to see him sort of like play opposite Christopher Lee, especially when you get towards the end of the film, I think.
Oh yeah, Moore's a weird one in this because I think I said this last week tonight. I love Roger Moore as the actor Roger Moore. I know that he's definitively Bond and how he would be with people, how great he was with the fans, his charity work. And whenever I get to the Moore Bond films, I'm always not. I think I am quite harsh on them, and I don't know why. Because I love him as Bond, but I always struggle. And I don't know if it's the sort of the age thing people play up when he gets those 80s ones and stuff. But in this one again, when I get him on, I really enjoy him, but I really struggle to see him as a spy, as James Bond. I always see him as Roger Moore. I know that's stupid because each Bond is big enough to be themselves, whatnot. But when you get sort of more in this, for his second film following from Live and Let Die, kind of what I said earlier, the problem I have with this film mainly is that it doesn't really feel like a Bond film in that, okay, like I could say Skyfall's got a problem similar-ish, but it doesn't feel like this is James Bond like on not an adventure, on a mission or whatnot, because I love it when they don't follow it, but the whole purpose of this film feels like, Bond, you're being wanted by an assassin that's the best assassin, so you're not doing anything, you're in retirement or you can kill him. And, it's absolutely fine, but at the same time, for someone that's still so new to the role where we didn't get that much from him in the first film again, I know that Spy Who Loved Me is the next one, which I would argue is the definitive Roger Moore film, which does have a payoff, but it feels like this is a Moore film that should have been later on. rather than one that came so early. I don't know if that sort of means sort of waffling on a point that's kind of irrelevant, but I struggle with him again in this film, and I think it's also the Christopher Lee factor that I always see this as the Bond film of Christopher Lee, and how many Bond films do I look at it and say this is the one with the villain actor in? Never. I think Christopher Lee, from the very few scenes we get of him, he always leaves you wanting more, and I struggle with him. I think Moore's fine. He's absolutely fine in this, and he's growing into the role. Absolutely, he's growing, he's getting better, but I just struggle with some of it again. And I think it's because, you see that all the photos, those two on the beach when they're back to back, and we get that scene. Whenever I see this film, I think it's probably only the 4th, 5th time I've seen it. You're just kind of wanting to get to those scenes that I'm not really fussed about anything else in the film. I just want to see Roger Moore versus Christopher Lee. And I think that's like a sort of essential issue I have with it. It's not really Roger Moore's fault. I'd argue it's maybe more the writing, but I just feel like that it's just something that's being missed in this one. I don't know if that's just me, but I'm not a massive fan on him in this film. In truth, I don't think they got the best out of him. That's probably a fair way of saying it.
Mm. Yeah, I'd probably resonate you a little bit there, George. I think it's a case of, firstly, Roger Moore's not really my Bond. He's not my favorite. He's probably not even top 3 of the Bonds for me. Yeah, he for me personifies the bits I don't like about Bond, the quippiness. I don't know. I like the suave, sophisticated side of things, but he never seems to be much of a spy, like you say. It's more just about like charming the ladies and just making quips and raising his eyebrow, and that's fine. People like that. Absolutely, love what you love. Perfectly fine. It's just not the one for me. So whenever I go to see a Roger Moore film, I have to kind of put myself in that mind space of like, right, this is what these films are. Don't expect spy work, don't expect physicality that you'd get out of Daniel Craig, and don't expect the dad James Bond that is Pierce Brosnan. So once you get that frame of mind down, it's fine. And he is firing on all cylinders, I would say, as Roger Moore's Bond. He's got that quippiness to him. He's suave, he's sophisticated. He's one point putting a lady in a closet and then making out with another one in the same room. That's pure Roger Moore Bond, as far as it goes. Mm-hmm. But as I say, I'm not a big fan of his performance overall as a character. But in terms of this film, I think it fits in flawlessly with the rest of them. But I do agree in the sense of I think Scaramanga, Christopher Lee, looms over this film. A height difference at least anyway. You can see it between the two of them, and I just want to see more of him. And it is always amazing going back to this, and I agree with you that there's just not enough of him. So you're waiting for the next scene, and then you almost want to like skip through the Bond stuff, which is not what you want out of a Bond film.
Right. Yeah. For me, like this one, when you look at most Bond actors, their second time at bat is usually the one where they define their screen presence. Because the first time around, they've gone through all these various castings to try to get their new Bond. They haven't written that script with that actor specifically in mind. So when you go down the road, whether it's From Russia with Love, whether it's even License to Kill, Tomorrow Never Dies, it feels like at that point they know the actor who's playing their Bond. Now, this one's a little different because I think it was released 1 year after Live and Let Die. I don't think they had the perspective yet. And so you look at the, Live and Let Die, that's kind of the Americanization of Bond. He's using like a revolver. He's got cigars. He's not doing the martini stuff. And so I feel like they didn't quite yet know who Roger Moore was. So this one, you have moments. Like I think the scene with the dancer in Beirut where he like swallows the gold bullet. That's pure Roger Moore. Like you are going to see more of that sort of stuff going forward. But then you have him like beating up Andrea Andrews on like the bed, and you're like, this is uncomfortable. This is not at all Roger Moore. And so I think they kind of vacillate between those two things, not quite knowing what his strengths are and putting him in situations that I know Roger Moore was quite uncomfortable with that Andrea scene. But it seems like they're just putting him into scenes that don't play to his strengths. Yeah. And also with a tone that doesn't play to his strengths. And that's something they obviously for him nailed down on their third time at bat. So in terms of the Bond story, I think it works. Like I always enjoy just watching Roger Moore just kind of coast through these kind of movies with that casual look, and you get some good quips here and there. But the problem is like Christopher Lee is so much like separate from him throughout this movie that, as you guys have said, you tend to focus more on him, and who Roger Moore is playing off of is Well, it's a mixed bag, and I'm sure we'll talk about those other characters coming up. But
Oh yeah,
it's a mixed bag. It doesn't necessarily play to his strengths the way that, like, Barbara Bach would in the next film, for example.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with the sort of like tonal shift that goes on with his character in this, because as you mentioned, the bit where he's slapping around the Bond girls, like on a rewatch, because I completely forgot about that scene. That was shocking to me, and I kept going, it's 1974, like this is a very different Bond. But I guess even if you go back to some of the early Connery films where he also does the same thing, that is very much the Bond character. Like, he is the gentleman spy, but he will stop at nothing to get the information that he needs for, like Queen and Country. And that is sort of like more of the darker side of Bond that we see, that we get elements of with Connery, but obviously that kind of devolved into, the formula of the Bond films, and kind of went very comedic as well, especially when we had Mankiewicz come on and start writing, especially when we get to Diamonds Are Forever. You've kind of got that comedic tone that more or less is, I'd say, everlasting with all of Moore's entries. Apart from scenes like that, as you mentioned. So I do agree there is definitely a tonal shift going on there, and especially when you get towards the end of the film, it does turn into that very campy, over-the-top caper that is, so intrinsic to Guy Hamilton's directing of James Bond, and especially Mankiewicz as the writer. And like the previous film that we talked about as well, Live and Let Die, how that was a very reactionary film to, blaxploitation films were very big at the time, and that was, intrinsic into Live and Let Die. This was also kind of similar as well, in that you had sort of like real world events that contributed to the ideas generated for this film. You had the 1973 energy crisis, and that kind of filters in a dramatic way in terms of the themes of this film, down to the MacGuffin, which the name escapes me now. It's this solar disruptor or something, isn't it? I forget the name of it that James Bond's after in this film.
Solex agitator.
There we go. Thank you. It's very much about sort of, energy and renewable energy and solar energy. And then Christopher Lee has a giant Death Star laser at the end of the film for some reason, because, hey, it's a Bond film and we need a villain that wants to make a giant laser for some reason. And then also you did kind of have a shakeup. Now, I don't know if this came sort of during the production of this film or after. I think it was after the film was all said and done. This was the final film of the pairing between Broccoli and Stoltzman as well. He sold his 50% shares afterwards to, was it United Pictures, was it, I think, afterwards? So, there was a 3-year gap between this film and the preceding film, Spy Who Loved Me, to sort of like iron out all of the legalities afterwards. So I think actually this film had quite a bit of a drop-off as well. I don't know, contemporary reviews at the time, I think, were pretty negative on this film. Yeah. I don't know if they felt like the franchise was in jeopardy or the formula had kind of ran its course at this point. But I think there was a bit of fatigue after this film came out. I know, obviously, it does have its fans and they find it charming in some ways with, Christopher Lee and Nick Nack and whatnot. And there is definitely stuff to like in this film, but it does feel like it's a hodgepodge when it comes to the script of this thing, which is so often the case that we say when Mankiewicz is involved in one of these films. Not only reactionary in terms of real life stuff, but also in terms of films as well. As I mentioned, Live and Let Die was blaxploitation. I'd say this was probably martial art films. I think they were pretty big during the 70s. I think you had Fist of Fury in 72 and Enter the Dragon in 73, the preceding year to this film, and even down to the fact that the end of the film ends in a Hall of Mirrors. I don't know if that contributed in that way and they wanted to go in that direction, but the whole middle segment of the film where you've got this sort of random martial arts caper that's just thrown in there. It's funny on a campy level, you get to see more take part in these martial art fights. And I do actually like the part where, is it Lieutenant Kip, I think is his name, the guy who he meets there, where him and his nieces are sort of like kung fu fighting all of the people in the dojo. Maybe I've just been watching Cobra Kai for too long, but I don't know. I got a kick out of that. I thought that was great. But it is very silly, and it does kind of feel like a melding pot of ideas that I don't know if it quite sticks the landing. It feels like you've got so many different ideas of loads of different locations and ideas for Bond films and characters that they kind of threw everything against the wall and essentially and see what sticks.
Yeah, I think that's a big problem with it, is that it is jumping around, and I think it is a part of the Bond era to be that sort of contextual analysis. Every decade, pretty much every film has it, even up to Spectre when it was waffling on about drones and all that kind of stuff with modern day evolution and I don't mind it when the Bond films do that, but when it was that, let's get a subplot in Japan. And even the whole path of that subplot is Scaramanga taking over the company. And it's kind of like, does anyone care? Like, does it have a resemblance on what happens after? And that's what's always sort of stuck out for me in this film, is that the input of it. And I love what you said earlier, Chris, about the sets when we're going somewhere new, but it doesn't feel like they're trying to do anything new. It just feels like it's one of those we can say, aha, we filmed here and we did this. And I think that's a big problem with what I've got from it. And I guess one of the biggest problems I have with the film is actually one of the Bond girls. We'll speak about Mary Goodnight first, because honestly, the surname should be enough for it to be a short conversation. To me, I don't know what they wanted to do, but that sort of bumbling, idiotic other agent. I know that a lot of films have done that in many different genres over the years, and they're always so predictable. But when he locks her in a wardrobe overnight and all that kind of stuff, I just think she's terribly written. And I don't think that's the actress's fault. And I think we get that with a lot of Bond girls over the years and whatnot. But it feels like, I think, because, we always talk about Unmatched Secret Service, that, when we've got Diana Rigg and we're starting to get better Bond girls, and then they'll take a step back. Well, quite often, I don't know, they tend to normally go 2 steps forward, then 1 step back, right? That's what I'd politely say. The Moira is obviously different to the others. But I really don't like her in this. I'd much prefer Andre Anders, who obviously we get a bit more time with, who has a very weird ending, which we'll get to. But Mary Goodnight, what's everyone's thoughts? Because I honestly hate
it. I had vague memories of her in my head from when I first watched this film. So go back into it today, I was like, okay, what does she do? And then she's just this bumbling fool who's chasing Roger Moore around the whole time. Now, I would be the same way. I would chase Roger Moore around personally, but
right.
That's just me. I probably wouldn't stand for being shoved into a cupboard. I have some principles, but I was watching this, and my other half came through as I was watching the film, and they were like, why is she walking around in a bikini? It just makes no sense. Why is she walking around in a bikini on this island when she's a prisoner? Why is she doing things to please Scaramanga? I honestly don't get it. And I just think they can write better female characters, female allies at this point. They've proven they can. They do go on to do much worse. But it's a shame. I'd say it's a shame.
It's funny because people will refer to Diamonds through this film as kind of the Mankiewicz trilogy. I think of it more as the sleazy 70s trilogy.
Right.
And that vibe extends right to the Bond girls. And, you ask, why is she wearing a bikini? Why was Tiffany Case wearing a bikini at the end of Diamonds Are Forever, right? Like, it's the sleazy 70s. They're just like, get the flesh up on the screen. Bottoms up, it's just like, it's a different vibe they're going for. And it's weird. And it plays very strange now. But, yeah, Mary Goodnight is a character. She's bottom of the barrel for me with the Bond girls. I kind of can appreciate what they're trying. Like, she's the first kind of light comedy Bond girl. Like, you look at all the others, they're very much tied to the plot. They specifically serve a function in relation to the villain or something like that. Mary Goodnight is like almost like a comedy character showing up in this movie. But that is very much clashing with other elements of the film. And also, she's not funny. And she's not given like really clever moments. She just gets to look stupid a lot. And also, I don't understand the decision to have Bond actively annoyed and put off by her throughout. Like, he's rolling his eyes the second she shows up. And that doesn't do anything to make the audience go, I really like Mary Goodnight. Clearly, if Bond can't stand her, she must be awesome. And yeah, she's like setting off, the Solex stuff by sitting on the button at the end. And you're like, oh, brother, like, Bond's getting annoyed. We're getting annoyed. It's doing nothing to make us like her character. So I feel bad for Britt Eklund, because when the audience and the script seems turned on your character, there's nothing you can do. But then you like contrast her to Andrea, and it's like, we'll talk about Andrea, I'm sure, in a second. But like, these two characters are in a completely different movie. Yeah. Like, Goodnight has wandered in from like a really goofy 70s comedy, and Andrea Anders is like really tragic and sad. So it's just a bad clash.
Yeah, I completely agree. I was watching this movie, and obviously Andrea's introduced first before we get to Britt Eklund. And, when Andrea's character's bumped off halfway through the movie, I thought, I kind of wish that she was the main Bond girl. I think she's a better fit. I think she has better chemistry with Bond in the film. But let's talk Mary Goodnight. I completely agree with you, Cam. She's just so insufferable in this film. And as you mentioned, like with Bond rolling his eyes at her, he's kind of like the audience proxy for this film. And especially when it gets to the end and he's shouting up instructions to her to turn the machine off. And as you mentioned, like she bumps the button with her ass when she bends it. Like it's just... Can we not? And Tiffany Case was instantly the Bond girl that I was reminded of when I was, greeted with Mary Goodnight in this film. And I guess that is sort of like a recurring thing from the previous films as well, like especially the Guy Hamilton ones, and even to some extent, Rosie Carver from Live and Let Die. That she is this agent that's meant to aid Bond throughout his quest, and she's completely incompetent now. I think that Rosie Carver kind of gets off lightly in this comparison because she is bumped up very early into the film. And, we were talking last week how we kind of wish that she had have been the main Bond girl, but, racial profiling at the time and everything, they wouldn't allow it, like the studio wouldn't allow that. So we get Solitaire come in as the main Bond girl in that film. That there was room to grow there. She can start off as a buffoon and, completely incompetent. Then by the end, she comes into her own and, helps Bond in the final act. You just don't get any of that with Mary Goodnight in this. And I always go all the way back to Dr. No with this, with Ursula Andress, because she's the first one. I guess she's the low-hanging fruit in this regard, in that she is just there to look good, to walk around in a bikini and not be heard and not be an active member in the plot. And they try to make Mary an active member in the plot, but she's very much just like a passive character in the narrative and how she puts herself across. So, also, it's quite funny with the casting of these two. So, they put a casting out and you had Maud Adams as Andrea Anders and you had Britt Eklund as Mary Goodnight. I think that Maud Adams got given the gig first and Britt Eklund got really upset because she thought that she'd been cast as the main Bond girl. But then the producers reached out to her and said, no, Britt, we'd like you to be the main Bond girl. I don't even know if I have ill will against Britt in this regard. I don't know if she'd had acting experience before. I know she was very much a model, which is kind of the formula that goes with a lot of the Bond girls, that they start out as a model and then just get given the gig as a Bond girl. So I don't want to come down like thunder on her because it's essentially down to the writing and the direction, right? Like if it was written that she had more of an active role and more of a sort of like a strong dynamic in the plot, then I'm sure she would have acted it accordingly. There are some moments where she's left in the wardrobe overnight and I thought, oh, that's, the player that is Bond, he's doing another girl on the bed whilst he's got another girl waiting for him in the wardrobe. So I don't know. It's very much of the time, as you mentioned, Cam, like the sleazy 70s. And I thought, that's completely Bond's character. But it is a shame, especially coming after, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which I keep going back to mentally as I go further and further in this franchise. I keep going back to that film and what it was trying to do and the maturity that it was trying to bring to it and the strong representation that you get in is it Tracy, I think her name is in that film, and Tracy's character. Mm-hmm. It's a shame. And I don't know what the next Bond film is. Maybe it's the next one, The Spy Who Loved Me, where the Bond girl kind of has more to do in it. I guess I'll find out as I go through in this retrospective.
I think a big thing with this is with Maud Adams that we'll get to it. Andrea Anders, obviously Maud Adams comes back in Octopussy, and it's the only Bond girl to come in 2 different roles, I believe. And there's that debate of the cameo in View to it is View to a Kill, where was she on set and they just happened to record her walking past in a crowd of extras, which is believed, or is it her? It's this eternal question, which we'll get to, but. I think she is by far the more interesting of the 2. It's not even an understatement actually at this point. I think she's, as you mentioned, she's a tragic character, and we get this whole subplot. And it does happen a lot in very much that kind of when there's always an antagonist and they've got the distressed wife or mistress or whatnot. Mm-hmm. But I love the fact this one feels different, and I'm not sounding horrible. I don't know if that's because she gets killed halfway through or whatnot, but you certainly. When you've got scenes with her and Roger Moore, I think they click. There's something working between them. And I think it's because there is that fear of the name for Scaramanga. You get the scene of him in bed when he's half asleep, and we all know Christopher Lee knows what's going on there. And I think she's great in this. And I think as many Bond girls get the unfortunate, insane deaths, the whole Frozen... it's not really Frozen, but the whole like gunshot there and the discussion with her dead body next to them. I don't know if there's a legacy because of how she dies. I know that sounds really horrible, but the Bond films seem to always have that, whether we've got Goldfinger. Obviously, we get the rip-off in Quantum of Solace. We've got Casino. So many Bond films, and obviously on Images, as we spoke about, they always get these memorable deaths, and I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. But in this one, it feels like that's the character you're rooting for. You wanted to get out. You wanted to try and have a new life, have something different. And we know she's cursed from the moment she starts helping them. At this point, 9 films in, I think we are now. It's clear as daylight she's not going to make it out of that film alive. And I think it's a crying shame, but I think it said lots to the producers. They brought her back, and they've not done that since.
Yeah, you know from the first scene that the Andrea Anders character is a sadness to her. There's this melancholy. She's drying off Christopher Lee, and he doesn't even say thank you, and she's just like, okay. And so it's trying to trigger that sort of that white knight syndrome that we all have, that we're trying to protect people, and we want Bond to come in and sweep her away from the evil Christopher Lee, the evil Scaramanga. And so you're rooting for Bond to try and help, and then you get that sad ending, very abrupt ending that still surprised me when I saw it again today. And they even do it when you have the scene where Christopher Lee is rather grossly wiping his gun over her. And it makes you cringe, and it makes you feel icky, and you want to get her out of that. And you're, again, hoping Bond can rescue her. So I think that's actually a very good angle to come from. I just think that it's a waste that they kill her off. I would rather have seen her get to the end and Merry Goodnight going to, goodbye.
If you had Andrea Anders in like a Craig era Bond, I think you could have had a really interesting character.
Yeah.
Because it feels like something they would be interested in exploring. Although they kind of dropped the ball with a very similar character in Skyfall. Yeah, or was it? It was Skyfall. Yeah, it was with Silva's girlfriend there. Yeah. So this movie introduces the Andrea Anders character, and I think she's the most interesting character. And maybe it's just because Maude Adams is a really good actress, because she gets so much across. There's a real vulnerability. You feel it when Bond is beating her up and stuff. You feel for her throughout that sequence. Bond is usually the character we're looking at everything through. In that moment, I think it shifts. We're actually in Andrea's position, and John Barry has this almost horror movie score that plays under a lot of her scenes. It's kind of this tinkling, ominous score. So when she's talking about how fearful she is and how she needs to get away, you're on her side. And there's a moment where she says something like, "You can even have me if it'll help me get away from him." And it's this is tragic stuff. This is a very dark element to the movie that the movie does not want to engage with. It's I know you guys haven't covered Moonraker yet, but there's a similar secondary Bond character in that with a Bond female character where she's in a completely different movie, and it's a very dark movie. And Andrea Anders, though, feels like the prime example of that happening in the Moore era.
Yeah, absolutely. And that opening scene that you get of her, where Bond's trying to seduce her with the whole belly ring and everything, it feels like I'm watching a noir film or something. The lighting in that scene, I do give props to Guy Hamilton for the direction, and that kind of leads on to the ensuing action scene, the beat 'em up, punch 'em up scene that we get afterwards. I love the way that he shoots the fight scenes. It feels very enclosed. It feels like you're, in that moment, in that room with that fight scene. So I love that one that follows, but she's definitely the more interesting character, and I think having her almost be an envoy between the two characters of Christopher Lee and Roger Moore, I think that would have been really interesting to develop that more. And even if she does die at the end of the film, that would have been fine. That would have kind of been fitting in a weird way, that Christopher Lee Scaramanga would know and be a step ahead of Bond, that she had some involvement in his undoing and he would dispatch her. So I don't have a problem with that, but it is when you have such a polar opposite Bond girl against a genuinely interesting one, as you mentioned, that has a more mature tone and feels like she's from a different movie. So we've kind of talked a bit about Scaramanga. I think we should move on to the villains right now. So I guess the only other thing I can say about Scaramanga, really, because I know we talked about him in the intro, he's kind of Christopher Lee. It's like a mic drop of an actor, really, isn't it? What else can you say other than it's Sir Christopher goddamn Lee? I think Jack Palance was originally touted to play the character. I don't know if it was a scheduling conflict or whatnot, but Jack Palance, to me, I've seen him in Tango and Cash, and probably Batman 89 as Carl Grissom is the one that always comes to mind. I could see him, and he definitely has a presence as well, the voice and his mannerisms. He does have a very iconic voice in the films that he's in, but I am glad that they went with Christopher Lee. But let's talk the henchman in this film. And I guess he does have the henchman role, even though there's that kind of, it plays with your perceptions at the start of the film, as Scott mentioned earlier. Nick Nack. I love Nick Nack in this film. I think it's kind of like a live and let die situation for me, where the villains kind of overshadow the rest of the film. And I think my fond memories of the film come specifically from the villains and the memorable quality that they bring to the film. Nick Nack's great. Just hit, the Frenchness of the character, just how he is a very different character from what we've seen before, and how he and Scaramanga are very much this sort of like odd couple. Like it's a very strange pairing of the two, but for the film, it kind of works. I don't know why. And I know that the actor himself, I'm not going to try and pronounce it because I'm going to absolutely butcher the pronunciation of that actor's name. I think he had a very tragic past. And I think ultimately how he died was, very, very sad. But, the legacy of Nick Nack, there are some, colorful language that's used in there to describe his height in the film. And again, it was the 70s, that was a thing, but he is probably the main thing that sticks out to me with this film, that is memorable and that I enjoy watching. Is a very interesting character. And as I mentioned, that kind of offset with Christopher Lee, especially, it's very different and it's kind of strange, but I think he's great in this film, especially when we get to the very end and, that Bond formula, how you dispatch the main villain, but then there's always a smaller altercation at the end of the film with one of the henchmen. And I think it works as well. I think he's great.
Yeah, I'm gonna give an attempt on the surname. I know the first name is Herbert. It's like Villashazi. My French is off, so I'm gonna leave that there. It sounds more Spanish, but I've got this connection with Nick Nack, right? And this is gonna make me sound terrible to people that don't know. So if anyone's listening from school, you'll know what I mean. When you've got a friend in your social group, you can get away with sort of mocking and whatnot. At secondary school, when you're like 12, 13, I used to have this James Bond visual dictionary that we'd bring in. And I think it was around the time Quantum of Solace came out. So everyone was reading and you were learning all this stuff. And we got onto the page of Nick Nack. And one of my really good friends at the time, we all just looked up and we realized that one of our best friends looks exactly like Nick Nack. And he was then called Nick Nack for the next couple of years at school. He was not a dwarf. He was a normal, I don't know, like a normal, like 12, 13 years height, but in the face, David looks so much like Nick Nack. And all of my memories, whenever I go to watch Man of the Golden Gun, I'll take a photo and I'll send it to that same group and I'll be like, it's David. And you can't unsee it. And I know it sounds horrible and it's very personal, but I love him. Aside from that, he is probably top 5 henchmen. I don't know. We can probably go into it properly when we've seen all of them, but I feel that he has an actual role in the story that, as we said, we get the opening scene and you don't know if he's actually trying to double cross Scaramanga. You don't know if he might also want to try and get out or if he really is good friends with him. And even when you get the repeat of it to Bond later, he says, if Scaramanga dies, I get everything. Could that have actually been the thing? We never know. But I think as far as that goes, he is one of the most memorable henchmen. I think I'm not going to unstate the obvious. Obviously, the height is a massive part of that. But I also think that story-wise, it's really interesting that he can have his boss playing a game with him. The whole maze dynamic, it's him in the control room doing it. And also, I kind of said this to Chris before we hit record, sorry. I love the fight at the end. I don't know if this makes me sound bad. It's as creative as you could be with a bedroom, right? When he's like scurrying and he's hiding into certain things and they could have played it for laughs. I know they do at points, but they could have just made that him jumping down on the bed and, ending, but they extend it. I don't know whether that's a good or a bad thing, looking at it with a modern lens. But to me, Nick Nack is very much that Bond henchman that you never want a henchman that's exactly like the main villain. If you had a carbon copy of Christopher Lee, you'd be like, well, what's the point? Why is this? They need not only in character, but they need visually to be different. We always talk about Odd Job, the fact that he was Korean, he didn't speak English, he had the hat. Nick Nack, we know, is a dwarf. He's very French. I've never seen interviews of her in real life, so I don't know if that was exaggerated accent, because we know that Bond films will exaggerate anything they fancy, but I think he is right up there in terms of iconic henchmen. And again, to me, Christopher Lee is right up there, but the highlight of this film is him and Christopher Lee together. It's nothing else. I'm glad, and I know it's really horrible, but even the payoff, the end that he didn't get thrown overboard, it's really bad that they leave him sort of, tied up on the mast and stuff. But
in the crow's nest, yeah.
Yeah, and it's kind of like a whisper from last week, status unknown. I'm guessing he got arrested after, but we technically don't know.
What a horrible way to go out if they just left him up on that mast, though. That's not particularly fun. No. when it comes to Nick Nack, I just think, in terms of henchmen, you think of From Russia with Love, Red Grant, Goldfinger, Odd Job, and then kind of a gap for me personally, and then Nick Nack. You just think of Nick Nack when you think of the man with the golden gun, and of course you get Jaws and maybe Xenia later on. So that means there's only about 5 or 6 that really stand out. That when you think of a film, you think of the henchman, and it goes to show they've managed to create this memorable figure in Bond history who has minimal lines. He's not in much of the film. He's just there a lot of the time, not saying anything, being imposing, actually a threatening force. And you mentioned the height issue. They still portray him as a force. There are laughs played in there, but he's got Bond to a gunpoint at one point. He could kill Bond. There is actually a threat behind him. And, there's also a really cool thing I like about Nick Nack is there's a trust between him and Scaramanga. That Scaramanga is trusting him to run the room with all the switches and such. And there's a lot of trust to put in the guy who could just stab you in the back, and he never does. And I like that relationship. I think it's quite nice that they actually just let them have this sort of trusting relationship between two really potentially horrible people.
You say there weren't many good ones for a stretch. I don't know. I'll go to bat for Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd, but when it comes to Nick Nack, they mentioned twice that if he succeeds in killing the man with the golden gun, then he inherits everything. So I think that actually gives the character a really interesting motivation, and that it's a sort of this honorable criminals, right? Like he's going to set up these illicit matches, but his goal is to beat the man with the golden gun to earn everything. But that's the only way he'll do it. He's not just going to cap him in the back of the head at a random moment. So I dig that element. It feels like they were putting genuine thought into writing the two villains. Like we've talked about the Bond girls, how they're in different movies completely. It felt like they put a lot of their energy into Scaramanga and Nick Nack. And that dynamic is really interesting. I like that Nick Nack gets the drop on Bond at a certain point, knocks him out, and is going to spear him basically on a bench. It shows that Nick Nack is dangerous. And that's something that I think, this was made in 1973. It would have been shot. A lot of movies in the 70s would have never played Nick Nack as dangerous. It would have been like, well, here's our comedy relief character. Mm-hmm. And he has funny lines. You get I still laugh at the voice from Christopher Lee yelling, Nick Nack, Tabasco. Yeah, Tabasco. There's weird moments like that always make me laugh. But Nick Nack is deadly. And the one thing, I don't know, I'm a little more mixed than you guys on the final fight. I like that he gets sort of the honorary henchman treatment where he gets to, take on Bond one final time at the end. But I don't know, when I have Bond putting him in a suitcase and he's yelling, let me go, I'm like, no, this character's too deadly. I would have liked more if they'd used his height as a weapon, which they kind of do because Moore can't track him down, right? He's getting away, he's going into the beds. I think I would have liked more of a final, maybe even more traditional villain face-off at the end there where Bond gets the drop, but it's very clear that Nick Nack was going to take him down if Bond didn't get the upper hand. I think it maybe for me personally would have done more to establish Nick Nack as kind of the perfect package of the henchman versus the one that's kind of, I feel like they kind of infantilize him at the end where it's like, oh, we got him in the suitcase. Oh, he's up in the crow's nest. He's misbehaved. That sort of thing. I think I would have liked maybe a harder end, but it's also maybe I'm asking for a completely different movie because he's way too likable. The other henchman, not that likable. Whereas Hervé Villechaize, in this movie, he's so you just like that character. You want to spend more time with him. He gets a fair amount of screen time. I wonder if they kept giving him more and more just because he was so iconic and working so well. So maybe that was a little bit of it. It's the audience is going to like him too much. They don't want to see him get bailed out the window, a la, the guy in Live and Let Die.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe he could have, you were talking about at the beginning of this review where you said, what was that fifth shot? Maybe he could have gone for that. I don't know. Maybe there could have been more of a standoff at the end of this thing. Part of me was expecting when it pulls back to that wide shot of, I guess it's a pirate ship, isn't it? There's no other way to describe it, really. It's like a pirate ship. When he puts him in the suitcase, I was just expecting the wide shot, you just see this case get yeeted off the side of the boat, and then obviously you get the final shot of him in the crow's nest. I see what you're saying, and I do appreciate them actually, especially with the 70s, not even the mid 70s at that point, dealing with him in a not so comedic way. Like he is just there. He is like the butler character. He's like the Batman essentially to Scaramanga's character. So no, I do like him there, and I guess should we talk about the Bond theme? I was going to talk about the Golden Gun itself because I think that's worth mentioning. What a hell of a prop! Probably one of my favorite movie props. I love how it all comes together. It's like an amalgamation of everything, really. It's like a fountain pen and like a cigarette case, isn't it? It's like a bunch of all these different items that all come together. I think I did some reading that 3 golden guns were made for the film, and I actually think the fate of one of them is unknown. I think it's been like stolen from some kind of exhibition or someone that had something to do with the film. One of them is missing, so someone out there has a golden gun, probably in their attic or their loft or something. So that's kind of interesting, but just the prop itself, it's such a striking movie prop, not just James Bond thing, but I think in movie history, it's quite important, not just because it's the namesake of the film, but I just love when like you have that scene of Christopher Lee putting that thing together. It just looks so cool.
The Golden Gun always brings like wonderful memories of course, GoldenEye on the N64. That's what people will say. I faithfully played 007 Legends, and it was the highlight of that game too, getting to play with it again online. And I don't know if anyone here is familiar with the 007 store. It's basically daylight robbery with the James Bond logo on it. They did limited edition Golden Gun replicas, and I think they were 850 quid. Mm-hmm. And it gets to a point with this website. Every time they announce something, I kind of half get excited, and then I realize that they're just adding a 0 to what it should be. But it's amazing because the set comes with it's got the whole package. It's got the lighter, the pen, it's the cigarette case, and then you get the cufflink as well. Mm-hmm. But it looks, if anyone's ever got one of them, that would be incredible to display. But it's the title of the film. It's not called Scaramanga, the film. It's the man with the golden gun, and we'll get to the theme in very shortly as well. But in terms of props, I think this is right up there. And even the design of it, how easy could it have been for them to make it look like a revolver that was gold, that looked like, especially the Bond comparison, a Walter PPK that's gold. The fact it stands out so much because it is that creation. And I always love that scene when he assassinates, I forgot the actor's name, the head of the company, when he's just, you see him take it off and he's doing something, and then suddenly the gun's there. It's such an interesting reveal. And for us as the viewer, when you watch the film later on, you see he is wearing the gun a lot of the times, and that's why he's not going to have that struggle. So the golden gun, absolutely love it, the design. And also, going back to Scaramanga, it helps make that character, right? You want to give Christopher Lee something iconic, if that's the title of the film. Having him over many of the other Bond villains have that weapon, I think was perfect.
I'll keep it simple. You hear in design, especially when it comes to like movie props and all kinds of things like that. I take this from Star Trek, is where I learned this skill. Is if you're designing like a starship, for instance, you want kids to be able to draw it, to be instantly recognizable, even with the crudest of designs. The golden gun, you get a gold pen, you do those little boxes, it's the golden gun from James Bond. It's simple, beautiful, and elegant, and that's it. Just goes to show they put a lot of time and effort into it, and it's timeless.
Yeah, I remember when I was a teenager, I used to read this magazine. I don't know if it was carried over on your guys' end. It was called Cinescape Magazine, and it covered genre films. And I remember they had an ad for a replica of the Golden Gun that broke down into the parts, and this would have been in the late 90s. And I remember just staring at that ad for so long, just, oh my God. And this is when I'm a younger teenager, so the idea that I would be able to pay, I'm sure it was probably like $400 or $500, was completely unheard of. Like, there's no way that would ever happen. And that's Canadian dollars, or no, I guess it was American dollars. So, yeah, it never happened. But the thing about the Golden Gun is I think it works character-wise incredibly well too, because it shows the sort of the patience and methodical approach that Scaramanga has. He's willing, you mentioned that scene where he kills High Fat. He's willing to sit there and just screw all the parts together. He's not in a hurry because he's so confident, and it all comes through that prop. And a lot of that is obviously tied to the Christopher Lee performance, but again, it's a prop that actually accentuates character, so that makes it that much more effective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, jumping on from the Golden Gun itself, I think we should talk about the main theme for this thing. So this is like a regular segment on all of our retrospective reviews. We have to talk about the main theme for this thing. So The Man with the Golden Gun, this one for this film was done by Scottish singer Lulu. Which, and again, this is kind of like a weird perception I have on this song, is that I remember hating this song. Like, if I had like the CD of like all the Bond hits, it's always one that I would skip. I just hated it. And I don't know if it's just because I'm in the mindset of kind of watching week to week these Bond films for the reviews that we're doing in the retrospective. I kind of got a kick out of this song. I really got into it. I think a big part of it for me, maybe subconsciously, is that John Barry returned for this film, because obviously he wasn't part of Live and Let Die. And I love the soundtrack to Live and Let Die. I mentioned like the blaxploitation thing. It felt very much like a score from one of those types of films, which I think worked for the tone of that Bond film that they were going for, to try and emulate that tone. But it even just like in terms of the soundtrack, it does feel like a return to form. It's like, okay, we've got the Bond theme, and then that also carries over into the brass and the actual score of the film itself. It's interesting though, because Barry allegedly only had 3 weeks to work on this score, which is absolutely maddening that he managed to get it done in as quick time as he did. But he has gone on record saying that in terms of all of his involvement of all the scores that he's done, Man with the Golden Gun is the one that he's least happy with. For whatever reason, it just says that something never really clicked with him when it came to the score, but that might be understandable, having that he had less than a month to compose all the music for this thing. But the actual theme itself, it's interesting that I was just doing some reading that Tony Bramwell, who apparently worked for Saltzman's music company, originally wanted Elton John or Cat Stevens to do the theme for this, and eventually it fell on Lulu. But interestingly, and I didn't know this until earlier today, Alice Cooper actually turned in a version of the Man with the Golden Gun theme, which I'd never heard before this point. I heard it literally a few hours ago before we went live on this thing. You can find it on his album Muscle of Love, and someone's done an edit on YouTube of that song, put to the actual title sequence of the film itself. And I think that theme would have worked a lot more. It would have gone with the kind of rock and roll sound that we had from Paul McCartney from Live and Let Die. I think it would have been a nice sort of evolution of that kind of sound for James Bond. And I think that Alice Cooper's version would have fit more for maybe the original draft, where there was so much of an emphasis on the Man with the Golden Gun himself as this opposite to James Bond. And I think that theme works more for that. Classic Alice Cooper, you've kind of got like the gothic macabre edge to it as well, and there's some moments in the song as well that almost feel like it's from like a fairground or like a fun house, which again would have tied in very nicely with Scaramanga's character. I think as it is, we get Lulu. I think I love the theme, and I love when Barry sort of introduces the actual melody line via strings, via orchestra into the film, and I think that works very well in the film. The one thing that I don't like, and I still don't like, are the lyrics. Don Black's lyrics to this theme, absolutely terrible. I guess you can kind of look back with them with reverence and, it was Bond, it was the 70s, whatnot. I do like the Bond songs that are a hype man for either the villain or Bond himself, so I do appreciate that it's kind of a 3-minute song bigging up how awesome Christopher Lee's character is. But the lyrics are terrible. Every line is an innuendo. I don't know where these sources come from in reviews, but people have described the lyrics as ludicrous. These are all quotes, apparently. Ludicrous, inane, and one long stream of smut, which it is. And I don't think lyrically it's great, but I think the theme does work for the film. I think that's probably just because, Barry came back for this thing and it's subconsciously, oh, this is the Bond sound. I'm familiar with this kind of sound for a Bond film.
It's an interesting theme. The timing's perfect. It's like the Queen watches us because Lulu's been made a dame this week, which I really wanted to bring up. That aside, now I know that Elton John could have done a Bond theme. I'm very biased. I think he would have been incredible. The lyrics are ridiculous, but in the same way, I love this theme. There's something about it that doesn't work, which is why it works so well. I don't know if it's the great John Barry score behind it and how excited Lulu seems to be singing it. But when I'm sort of got my Bond playlist on, this is one of the ones I won't skip. I do let it go, depending on how loud I'm meant to like sort of be. When you're trying to play music quietly, then this song's actually like, no, got to go on to the next one. But I quite like the theme. I think the placement of it, because we've had that Christopher Lee opening, the transition into the beginning of the song, I think really works well for this film. But yeah, in terms of lyrics, it's not good. It's not up there with some of the great ones. But there's a place for it. And if you're gonna, I don't know if this sounds horrible, but if you're gonna have some ridiculous over the top thing, right? What better film to put it in than a Roger Moore? I mean, we look at the Craig ones, and we'll get to some of the more recent ones, but there is a bit of a trend with some of those songs that Chris will say they're quite dreary and depressing. And I don't like the Sam Smith one, but they work for that iteration of Bond, and that's how I always say that the transitions of the voice on screen to how it is, bar maybe another way style, which I do like, on the only person on the planet. Whereas, I don't know, the Man of God, I think it works, but it shouldn't work, but to me it does. And I think that's got me indicating that I'm going to let it slip because it's about Christopher Lee. That's probably my only explanation in truth.
I'm not going to be as positive you two are, unfortunately. I put this song into my Sam Smith wing of Bond tracks, the ones I'd rather set my head on fire than listen to again. It's truly awful. I mean, you come off from Paul McCartney. Paul fucking McCartney does your theme tune. You're like, yes, this is the pinnacle, and then you just go back down to Lulu. It's like I'm listening to Tom Jones again. It's horrible.
We like that one too. I like
Thunderball. We've got Thunderball coming up in a little while. And sorry, Cam, it's a bit of a preview. I don't like Thunderball. But I don't know. Not a fan. What I will say is, if you're gonna have Christopher Lee in the film, just have him sing the theme tune. He was in metal bands. Sod it. If you're going to have Alice Cooper, let's have Christopher Lee.
He did his Christmas album, didn't he? I think in his 90s.
Yeah,
how many people can say that? Can you imagine there's a world somewhere where Christopher Lee sang those exact lyrics?
Well, he sings. He sings. He kind of sings, really. Let's be fair, doesn't he? But I'll count it.
So does Billie Eilish. So, hey, if that's getting published, why not?
Yeah.
Yeah, like for me, I feel like the Lulu song is the fireworks at the end of the sleazy 70s Bond trilogy. Like, is it good? No. Do I love it? Yes.
Right. Yeah.
It's just total like garbage music, but it's one I never skip. It's like 2.5 hours or 2 hours. My God, Jesus. That's how it felt to Scott. It's 2.5 minutes. And plus, I always laugh at the refrain at the end where it starts with the good night. It's like, oh my God, like it's so bad. So the lyrics are horrendous, but to me, it's just, I can't say it doesn't fit the movie because the movie has that sleazy vibe. So it's pretty spot on. Like I watch, some of those Daniel Craig films and you hear like the song and you're like, what was this for? The Sam Smith one, I'm like, this doesn't fit this movie at all, nor did the Radiohead song that they composed for that one either. It's like what were they thinking? So Lulu was on point. She understood the movie. John Barry understood the movie scoring. And as for, you saying John Barry was disappointed in the score, it's a very minimal score. You can tell that it's got a lot of tinkling. It's got a lot of just like, kind of the laid back version of the theme song. So it doesn't feel like it's his greatest. Plus, it has the most egregious score moment of all time.
So I was going to mention this, mate. Fair play to you. You went the extra mile today with that. Did you buy that especially for this review? Can I ask that, or did you have a slide whistle on hand at all times?
No, we actually bought it. I bought it for for our podcast,
right?
But you guys got the premiere because I haven't used it on that show yet.
So. Oh, nice! We got an exclusive. I don't know how to come back after that. We could just end the review after that, right? Can we?
It's the perfect segue because
it is.
Next was the car chase, which is. I'm trying to recover from that. Sorry, that was wonderful.
That's amazing. That's the best part of this review so far. So the car stunt. I mean, I'd go so far as to say this is probably one of the most iconic car stunts in history. I think that it has its place in history. I think it was the first stunt that was worked out via computer to sort of get all the bells and whistles down and the angle and everything down. Now, I had very different memories of this stunt. I've clearly seen this clip multiple times on best film moments and best Bond moments or whatnot. It's always on there and it absolutely has its rightful place on there in movie history. I think this was a thing with more of the Guy Hamilton films in that they struck a deal with some kind of product placement deal with American Motors Corporation, I think. So you clearly see a lot more muscle cars in the franchise, especially like Diamonds Are Forever and stuff like that, and Live and Let Die. You get all of that kind of stuff in there as well. I forgot about the slide whistle until I watched this a second time. Well, last night it was actually, which was a huge thing for me. Not just that, but J.W. Pepper, I believe his name is, who was a was a particular talking point in last week's review in Live and Let Die. He's a very much a Marmite character. You either love him or you hate him. And I think last week with the three of us on that review, it was pretty much a unanimous vote that we all hated that character. Now, I was pre-warned before going into this one that he did return in this film. And there's the moment where he kind of gets the cameo. He's out with his wife and he crosses paths with Bond again. And I do like that moment in the score, actually, where you get like a little bit of a reprise of the Live and Let Die theme. I thought, oh, that's pretty cute that they went back to that. And I thought that was it. But oh no, he comes back and he is present all the way through that action scene. He is in the very car that Bond is driving. And he's at his most J.W. Pepper, I think, is the only way that I can really describe it. I hate the character, and that's, clearly Mankiewicz's influence coming through in the script to get that campy, comedic tone coming through. And yeah, we get to this stunt, and I was like, we're gearing up for it, and I was getting hype, like, we're going to see this stunt, and then that damn slide whistle kicks in, which was actually a decision made by Barry himself. He did that. He later regretted it, and I don't think there was a single person that enjoyed it. I don't think Guy Hamilton liked it. Anyone who worked on it liked it, and Barry, as I mentioned, went back and said, yeah, that was a mistake. I played that differently. He played it very much for laughs when it was meant to be a daring, dangerous James Bond action set piece, and it didn't come across as that. And I remember messaging you, George, right after that scene had finished. And I said, what the hell did I just witness? This wasn't how I remembered it. This isn't how I should remember this scene. As a stunt, it's fantastic and fair play to them. They did sort of play it back in slow motion because they mentioned in regular speed it was over before it began. And you, as an audience member, you wouldn't have taken that in or that moment. So I appreciate them doing it in slow motion. But yeah, that slide whistle. I mean, it did lead to just a great moment on the review. So there is that. But in the actual movie, not so great.
It's such a conflicting one because you know what I'm like when it's stunts, when it's action. To me, the Bond films have always been, I would argue that it's a different conversation. Mission Impossible bears the brunt of that now. What daring thing are we going to do that no human can do right now? That's very much the Tom Cruise Mission Impossible vibe. Obviously, I'm not going to say what the stunt is in the next film, but there are clips of what they're doing, which is insanity. And you go back to the 70s, and it was done sort of, I don't want to say maths and science wise. I remember seeing a video on it. They had to get it done on a computer to work out how they could build it, to get the angles, the physics, the speed, all of that kind of stuff. And I know it's hard to take it in because it's the 70s. I know they put it in slow motion, which I completely understand, but I feel like the side whistle undoes a lot of that. Now, whether at the time a lot of people thought it was funny, the audience, is another conversation. But I think obviously it's easy to look at things in a modern lens, and it doesn't look good because not look good, sound good's probably the better example. And it's such a weird one because Chris, as you said, we're getting these muscle car chases, and I really didn't like the speedboat chase in the last film. It just went on for so long, it didn't stop. Whereas this one feels, it's not, obviously it's nowhere near as long, but there are moments where, because we know the stunt's coming, because it's not the first time we've seen it, you're kind of like, please.
Oh, here we go. This is what we're talking about. This is where he drops out. Give it a second. He'll be back anytime now.
Oh, sorry. It's cut me off. Sorry. I don't know what part it cut me off, but essentially what I'm trying to say is that the stunt itself, I think, has been sort of not looked upon it. Contextually, it's beautiful. I don't think because of choices they made for the film, we miss out on how important that really is. And I don't think that's something that I'm not going to say haven't bigged up enough. We get it in so many montages of the franchise, but I think because when you watch it in the film, the context of the film itself, it feels played for laughs because of the supporting character in the car. And I don't know at this point if I'm waffling or not, but it's such an important stunt for cinema. An integral moment, but I don't think the film itself gets the payoff it deserved. Is probably a fairer way of looking at it.
We recently had a guest on our show, and they'd never seen any. Pretty much, I'll say it again. They'd seen few Bond films, but they did reference that scene and that jump. And so it's obviously penetrated into the wider sort of cinema arena. People know that stunt beyond the film. And yeah, I went to the Bond in Motion exhibit in London a couple of years ago, and they've got the car, and they've got the clip playing in the background, and you see people walk up to it, and they kind of laugh when you hear the slide whistle. But it's almost like it's a community thing now. We've all been through it, we've all laughed at it, and we all just know it's kind of fun. It was a silly choice, and we can look at it and go, "Why did you do that?" But I think all of us can see beyond that silly choice and go, "Wow, that was a spectacle, though. That was a hell of a jump." And in terms of like driving sequences, we've covered some god awful driving sequences so far on the show. This is quite compact little sequence. Sure, it wasn't like a Jason Bourne, but they haven't done those yet. For the 70s, this was pretty well paced.
Yeah, I mean, it's the sort of sequence that it's not like the edge of your seat thrill ride, but it's effective. And as for J.W. Pepper, I enjoyed him very much as a kid, but as an adult, when you're watching him like yell racist terms out the window of a car, you're like, not as wonderful as I remembered. Okay, interesting. But the actual corkscrew turn on that car is incredible. Like my favorite anecdote there was that when they pulled it off, the producers were like, "It looked too good. People are going to think it's fake. Could you redo it?" And they were like, "No." Like, no, moving on, we're done. So it's a scene that I think is very important in the Bond sort of canon for stunts. It's one whenever you see like those moments, they'll put like a compilation up of all-time great Bond stunts. You're going to see that one in there. And it is one of the great action sequences of the movie. It's probably the signature one in a movie that doesn't have maybe as many iconic action sequences as some of the other ones. You get the chase in the, down the river. There's not a lot when you especially compare just in terms of iconic terms, not in quality terms, that boat chase to the one in Live and Let Die. Like everyone thinks of that movie as the boat chase movie. Mm-hmm. So the car jump is the one. And yeah, it's undone a little by the slide whistle. But one thing I think is interesting is a lot of people will often say, well, this ties so much into the 70s with things like Smokey and the Bandit, Cannonball Run, all those sorts of movies, that big craze that went on. But this one predates them. So in some ways, it's kind of paving the way for what audiences are really going to enjoy in the years to come.
Yeah, and I think there's quite a quaint charm. We always talk about this with the early Bond films, especially 60s into 70s. Now, granted, I haven't got to the 80s ones yet. I'm an 80s guy. I love my 80s movies, so I can't wait to get to those, those Dalton ones and sort of like the end of Moore's legacy, going into View to a Kill and everything. But I always love the rear projection and, filming as much of the stuff in camera as you can, and the tricks of the trade that they had to kind of cobble together to get the films looking as good as they could based on the limitations at the time. So even though it's just, now we'd view it as a simple car corkscrew, but back in the time, that would have been absolutely revolutionary. So going back to these older Bond films, you always have to kind of be privy to that and understand what was going on in cinema. And in many ways with this stunt, what wasn't going on in cinema at the time, that would have been astounding to some people. We are kind of spoilt now with modern cinema, I think, in terms of, whether it is in camera stuff and, you can pretty much, the sky's the limit now when it comes to films, especially with digital technology as well and enhancements. What you can think of, you can pretty much put on camera. So regardless whether I like the film as a whole, I do still appreciate the time and effort that it went to take to, make these things possible. Just mentioning the guy who performed the stunt, apparently it was Loren Willett. And after performing the stunt, after completing it in the one take, on the spot, he was given a $30,000 bonus. So that was a good day to be a stunt driver, I think, after that. That's how you get the job done. And maybe that's going to be one of our favorite scenes. But, we always move on to a segment on one of these as to what some of our other favorite scenes are. I'm trying to think of one for me. I mentioned the fist fight that you get with Bond after he's talked to Andrea's character. I really like that. I think it's well shot. And I don't know if it's that part of the film or if it's at the end when he fights Nick Nack when he's throwing the bottles, but it looks like one smashes into the camera. It's like very close to the camera, which I noticed. I can't remember if that was that first fight or towards the end. So I'd probably say that for me in terms of favorite scenes. And then I'm trying to think of anything else. I quite like the duel with Christopher Lee. And I think originally that the duel was much longer. I'm guessing it was kind of almost done to emulate a Western, just, the really, you go to any of the Sergio Leone Western films, right, and how much they drag out the anticipation of those final duels between those characters. And I think maybe in a film that had kind of played up Scaramanga's character a lot more and that dynamic between the two, that would have been a very interesting finale. As it is, it's just cool to see Christopher Lee and Roger Moore in a 20-pace duel. I quite like that. So that'd probably be one of my favorite scenes as well.
Mine, it's another Christopher Lee scene. I know it's the dead body with Andre Anders, but I love their discussion when there's that sort of deep respect that Christopher Lee has for James Bond. And it is weird when you go back to the opening scene because he's shooting the fingertips of James Bond and all that stuff, which is, you love him so much, you've got a statue of him, yes, but then you're shooting him. But I like the fact that we know they're going to get into it eventually, and it's that very much antagonist meets protagonist, their sort of sit-down moment with one another, and I do like that moment. And I think the finale itself, the duel is okay, as in when it gets the mirrors, but I hate the whole factory tour and all that kind of stuff. I think you start to lose it a bit, some of the charm you had, but certainly those two meeting for the first time was a standout for me.
My favourite scene was probably the scene where Britt Ekland's bum saves the day. No, I'm actually going to go slightly away from obvious ones. I really loved, we haven't said enough about it, the scene on the boat where they have the hidden, MIA5 base.
Yes.
Yeah, and everything's just slanted sideways. I was actually going to tilt my camera sideways to start this off to really throw everyone off. But I don't think a lot of this stuff gets mentioned when Bond gets reviewed, but like the set pieces and the sets that they create a lot of the time just sit in the background, don't get noticed by a lot of people. But that was fantastic. It really was an excellent bit of geography, well thought out, and that's one of the things that I always think about in the film. It's the film with a sideways boat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a great location, and there's a number of them because also like the whole amusement park shootout place. It has a lot of nods, as you said, to Enter the Dragon, but also Lady from Shanghai, the Orson Welles film. So it's really beautiful. For me, there's two scenes that jump out, and I think one is really flashy, and one is one maybe people overlook. So I'll say the flashy one first, I think, which is the karate fight or the kung fu fight, because they make reference to karate at a certain point at karate school, and then I'm confused as to exactly what it was supposed to be. I would assume kung fu given the location, but I like that it shows that Roger Moore is not a martial artist. Like, they don't try to make him immediately like a martial artist, and that he kind of gets by just because Bond is very clever on his feet. You see the way he's getting beaten up, but he managed to take down like the guy in the black gi just through cleverness and strategy. Like, I really like that. It shows a different side of what Roger Moore's Bond maybe could have been, because they don't really go down that route again. But I think it's an interesting idea. But I think the best scene in the movie probably is the scene where he goes to interrogate the guy who creates the bullets for Scaramanga. And in Beirut, I believe it was, or no, I don't think it was. Was it Bangkok? I think I can't remember.
They jump around a lot in this film, I think, in terms of locations.
Wasn't it Macau?
Yeah. Yes, thank you, Scott. It was Macau. Yes. So at any rate, like, he is like aiming the gun at the guy's crotch and has the "Speak now or forever hold your peace" line. It feels like we're tapping into that sort of that threat level that Connery had, but measuring it with the humor of Moore. And it wouldn't shock me if the producers, watching the final product, looked at moments like that and said, okay, that's what we need to write to going forward. Because it does feel like they go a little more down that road in the future.
Yeah, and I like that we get to see those seeds of more interrogating people and sort of being the classic gentleman spy that we kind of want from James Bond, and really, in hindsight, that we don't get all that much of, really, or very sparingly, at least. And going back to what you mentioned, Scott, the RMS Queen Elizabeth set, that's probably my second favorite set out of all of the films. I think just based on scale, number one's always going to be Blofeld's Lair from You Only Live Twice, just because that was, absolutely tremendous, like the size of that. But I do like those kind of expressionist, quirky, sort of like off-center sets that you get in some films, and it is very disorientating, and from the framing and everything. But I thought as a headquarters for M and Q and everything, that was a really interesting choice of playing with that, that real life wreckage. So I thought that was pretty cool. So I guess favorite scenes takes us on to my favorite segment of each week. I always mention this, the James Bond one-liner of the week. And there's not as many in this film as I thought there would be, but there are some amazing ones. And actually, my favorite one comes from right at the end. So I'm going to try and not mention them all. I always make notes on as I'm watching the movie, ones that stand out to me. So the first one is where he's with Andrea, and she says, "I've lost my charm," and he says, "Not from where I'm standing." And I think it's when he's like making out with her. Great. Grizzlyland stood out to me as like a really so bad. Actually, no, it's just a bad one, really. I guess it's a play on Disneyland. He's walking through Scaramanga's fun house, and he just kind of goes, "Grizzlyland," whatever. This is a close runner-up, actually. There's a useful four-letter word. Sorry, there's a useful four-letter word, and you're full of it when he's talking to Scaramanga at the dinner table. Yeah. Great one-liner. But I think my favorite is when he's on the phone to M at the end of the film, and he's calling for good night, and he says, "She's just coming, sir." It's so it's the sleazy 70s, as you mentioned, Cam, but it's just great. And then good night, sir, and then he hangs up on him. I guess that's probably my favorite of the film. I don't know if you guys found any more or any other one-liners that stand out to you guys.
Nothing more than the four-letter word one. I think that's the best one for me.
Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
I did have one. Actually, it came to me very early on in the film. And it's not so much of a quip, it's just more of like a weird sentence, but it just stuck out at me anyway. So he's just spoken to Saida, the belly dancer. He's trying to get the bullet. And he goes, "I say, you have a magnificent abdomen."
Does
that compliment work? I should use that more often.
I was like, does it work? I feel like I need to. I'm not going to put it into practice. I'm not going to do it. I'll save that for Roger Moore. Right. It's so anatomical, right? Like, yeah.
I think the "Speak now or forever hold your peace" is the best line. It's the most clever one. I always laugh though with the "foo yuck."
Yeah.
That's the name of the champagne. That always makes me laugh, and the fact he repeats it again when he gets back to the hotel in a different term. He's like "foo yuck." So that one's pretty good.
I always, as we've gone through, and I know inherently Austin Powers is a parody on the James Bond films, but there's even now like so many films in. I thought we got done with all like the Austin Powers comparisons, but it just reminds me of Goldmember with like "fuck me" and "fuck you." I thought that was, it's nice to see the origin of where those jokes come from. But I guess that takes us nicely on to sort of final thoughts on the movie, and it's kind of it's a mixed bag for me, and I feel really bad about it because I remember this film so differently from the rewatch. I think, the easiest thing to go to immediately is Christopher Lee and Nick Nack. I think the villains are easily the most interesting thing about this film. I do really like Andrea's character as well, but as it stands in the film, she's very much sidelined for Brick Ekland's character, which, I'm not a fan of. The theme is what it is. I think it's more sort of like the impact that this had, and you can not only, I actually thought that Enter the Dragon came out after this film, but clearly it came out 1 year before this film. But even with modern action films, and the one that I always go to is John Wick Chapter 2, in that film ends in a hall of mirrors, and, whether that was just done stylistically for that film, it does always remind me of Man with the Golden Gun, and that we are still getting action films that maybe not inherently are completely beholden to it, but are at least inspired by it in some way. And as I mentioned, sort of like the quaint charm to some of the stunts in it as well, sort of like going back and seeing where almost like the origin of where, we see car chases now and just crazy action on screen that we kind of take for granted. But it's always nice to go back to some of these older films and see the humble beginnings of it. So I do appreciate this film for those elements to it. And I think that, if someone says that they regard this film as a classic, I'm not going to argue with them, because there are the elements in there that are memorable, mostly Nick Nack, Christopher Lee, as I've mentioned, and, the car stunt in there. But as a whole, as a film, and I blame On Her Majesty's Secret Service for this, because that film is sort of like the benchmark for me that I always keep going back to now and comparing Bond films to, that they were trying to do something maturer. And, maybe if they kept trying to do that with every Bond film, maybe it wouldn't have the legacy that it has now, because maybe so much of the legacy, and while they've made almost, 25 films on it, 24 films, however many it is that formula, that set formula. But I feel like the formula was at odds with this film. It felt like it was a bunch of different ideas that they were trying to cobble together and never really found its footing. I think if they'd have gone with the original idea, maybe, and this is just speculation because I've never read the script. No one's read the original script. of having this character of Scaramanga be this complete opposite to Bond and focusing on the two. And, you know, Bond always escapes these crazy scenarios, but having someone go up against him who's kind of like an agent, who's a gun for hire, that can stand toe to toe with Bond, I think that would have been really interesting. And you could have really played into that dynamic, maybe with Andrea's character as well, being this envoy between the two. This is all speculation on a film that never existed, and we've got to sort of review the film that we have. So as it is, it kind of feels like a bit of a hodgepodge. It feels like a little bit of a mess. I don't hate this film. I still think it's entertaining. I still think it's very watchable, and it's nowhere near as bad as the like as Diamonds Are Forever, which I think is still my least favorite so far out of the ones that I've seen. But yeah, it's sadly, it's not as I remember it. But I think it's still watchable, but I do think it's pretty mediocre as Bond films go.
I'm in a territory of this one because I'm not necessarily a fan of the more era. There's sort of good moments amongst it, and some of those moments are individuals, and some of those individuals are Nick Nack and Scaramanga. So I'm in a weird sense that if I was telling someone, you know, here's some definitive Bond films to watch, this may slip in if I'm feeling nice, if the list is of a certain length and it's more about getting the villains on. So I think as far as a Bond film goes, I don't think this is a great Bond film. Spy film, there's basically no spying, so I can't even really apply that from it. But if you want an action film, this has moments, and this is where I'm torn because I've got a lot of love at moments of this film, but the film itself isn't all there for me. But I feel that maybe, you know, if I'd have been around back then, as many different audiences are, they've got different Bond films at different parts of their lives and whatnot. I think this is one where time hasn't benefited it, but you can look at it from that contextual perspective that this film was one of the important ones, I guess, at the time. And overall, I think it's not quite there, but there's enough memorable things about it for it to be seen as one of those Bond films that people should watch. Not necessarily the quality of the film, but basically just Christopher Lee and Nick Nack in absolute truth. I don't know. I'm really torn on this film because I always have differing opinions every time I see it. I've seen it 4 or 5 times now, and I never really know what to make of it after I've seen it. I'm a bit placed. I struggle to see it as a Bond film. It's kind of what I said. It's that Kong versus Godzilla. It's Christopher Lee versus James Bond, and that's how I see this film. It doesn't really feel like it's a part of it. And as someone that hasn't read the books, knowing what I do know with it being sort of the final Ian Fleming book, with it being one that didn't get that second draft because he passed away and whatnot, I feel as if that could also affect how the film is or came to be. So I'm in this unknown quantity, which is quite rare for me.
I think for me, this film is on the precipice of being in the top Bond contention. But there's things that need to change for it to be in that, you know, that conversation. And I'm talking about, we need more Scaramanga, we need better Bond girls, both of them, and maybe a bit less of the karate / kung fu stuff. I don't think we needed that influence personally. If those were changed, but we're talking about a different film, I think we would be looking at maybe top 5 or at least top 10. Right now, I think what we have is a fun film, one of the better Roger Moore entries, but it's definitely in the middle, and it's definitely in the middle of the whole pack of Bond films, I would say.
Yeah, I would also get rid of all the solar energy stuff. Like, my favorite scene, maybe, you know, just comedically, is the moment where like Bond is explaining all the solar energy stuff to Scaramanga, and Scaramanga looks so bored, like he could not care less, and that's how I felt, and that's why this movie for me, mixed bag is the perfect term, in that it has like some great stuff. We've talked about those moments. I'm not going to go over them again, but you've got the Nick Nack Scaramanga stuff. So like it has its iconic elements that will show up on any highlight reel and fans will look back on. But it feels somehow to me less inspired than the one that came before it, which again doesn't necessarily feel wholly confident because they hadn't figured out who Roger Moore was as their James Bond. But you just look at a lot of the characters in that film, a lot of the situations, it just feels like a movie that it seemed to click better. Whereas this one, it comes in fits and starts. So it's not a movie I can ever, I'll never hate it. Like I've watched this movie more times than I care to ever admit. It's depressing, frankly. Think of the hours of my life I could have been achieving things that I spent watching The Man with the Golden Gun. And I know I'll watch it again many times, but it's one that when I tend to think of the Roger Moore era, it falls near the bottom for me. I don't think it's in the bottom spot, but it falls lower, and it just is that lack of inspiration, the fact that they haven't figured out his James Bond, and you know, the Britt Eklund of it all that just does not work. So, it's fun, but it feels a little inconsequential to me.
Yeah, Cam, I think we all have one of those films that we've seen more times than we care to mention. I think mine's probably Batman and Robin. I think that's probably we all have that guilty pleasure film, right?
Me too.
Yeah, the solar energy stuff, it's like, Christopher Lee gets a hold of a Death Star at the end for the second time in his career, I guess. And he just blows up a plane with it. It's like, let's, and he says, I really will be the man with the golden gun. It's like, well, no, the golden gun is the golden gun. Let's just keep it to the namesake. We don't need a giant death laser, which is actually the golden gun. Anyway, that'll do it for our review on The Man with the Golden Gun. Obviously, this is pre-recorded, but you guys watching will be commenting along and, replying to you guys' comments. Let us know what you think of this film. Do you think it's as divisive as we've made it out? Do you like it? Do you hate it? I think this one's going to fall in the middle for quite a lot of people, actually. But please be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe as we go through all of the James Bond films. And, of course, we'll be back next week as well with The Spy Who Loved Me. That's going to be Tuesday, the 22nd of June at 8 p.m. Every week that we always go live at that time. And, of course, if you want to find us on social medias, we've got Facebook at Cinema Savvy, Twitter at Cinema_Savvy, Letterboxd at Cinema Savvy as well, and you can find a link to our TeePublic in the description down below where you can find some of our merch. I want to say a huge thank you to you, Scott and Cam, for jumping on with us tonight for this film. Thank you for rewatching the film firstly and getting through it, whether that was a painful experience or not so painful experience. And before we round off, if you just want to talk a little bit about the SpyHards podcast and what it's about and where people can find you at.
Absolutely. So SpyHards Podcast is a simple podcast. We watch a spy film every week with a goal of trying to find the best spy films of all time. And we're talking any spy film. We're going back to the 20s, 30s. We're up to date modern times. Now we'll do our James Bond. We'll do the Jason Bournes. But in between, we'll find some fun and not so fun films to cover along the way. But this list of the best films ever, we call the Knock list. But I think Cam is the best at explaining that.
Yeah, the Knock list is the need-to-see official classics of the SpyHards canon. So we are looking to create the pantheon of all-time great spy films. So every week, after we finish talking about the movie with either just Scott or I or with a guest, we decide whether the movie, we basically will vote whether it makes the Knock list. So movies that have made it in, for example, like North by Northwest, GoldenEye, Bourne Supremacy. So there's some really interesting stuff in there. And we're always looking to add to it. And we don't want it to be a snobby list either, where it's only the, 5-star Sidney Lumet classics of the era or something like that. Like, we want to work in all sorts of entertainments. So it's a very inclusive list. And so that's kind of what we do. And we should add, have lately been doing more and more interviews with filmmakers when we can, for people that have written some of the films we talk about, directed some of them. So that's something we're looking at doing more of in the future. So we kind of try to cover all the various facets of the spy canon. And yes, we do talk to filmmakers about movies we don't like, which is sometimes even more interesting.
You have to sugarcoat it a little bit maybe in that regard. But I'm halfway through your guys' Charlie's Angels one. I don't know whether that will make the Knock list. I guess I'll find out at the end of that thing. But go check these guys out. Give them a follow them on Twitter and Facebook. The links are there. We'll also have links in the description down below as well. They're going across the screen at the moment. Informative, funny, and I think the best thing about it is that it's spy movies, so it's so vast, and it's not just Bond, it's not just a given franchise, it is all inclusive of the spy genre. So I think that's definitely the appeal to it. So definitely go check them out. I think it's quality content.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us.
No,
absolutely.
With that, we shall see you next week. I want to thank everybody for watching, and we'll see you then.